Hi, Honors Chem students. This video is about how to write a good scientific procedure to collect data. So here is a recipe for easy chicken enchiladas. So recipes are a lot like scientific experiments, and here we have a procedure. So here are the ingredients, and in our experiments we call them materials, but you can see in this recipe the ingredients list the things that are used, the amounts that are used, and details about the things that are used. It also includes instructions that are detailed in a step-by-step manner that can be followed to carry out the recipe, and we'll also be listing our instructions in our procedure. So here's my example scientific question that I'm going to use to help you think about how to write a procedure for your question or goal. And my question is, how does the amount of baking powder affect the height of cupcakes? And here's my hypothesis. I'm going to say that more baking powder will make the cupcakes rise higher. So the first thing you're going to do for your procedure is to brainstorm a list of materials that you'll need to carry out the procedure. So on your research proposal template, I would just start brainstorming and typing down things that you think you're going to need for this procedure. So for example, in my example with the cupcakes, I would just start a bulleted list. I would start writing down, typing down things that are in my recipe, my cupcake recipe, and I would just write those down and get them down on my paper. So I would do a first pass of the general materials. There's going to be a lot of things like my cupcake pan, measuring spoons, so you're just going to list down things that you're thinking of. And then what you need to do is go back and do a second pass and put in some details. You want details and amounts. So I could put in here a 12 cupcake pan, a 12 well cupcake pan. I could put in here, and I should, that this flour is all-purpose flour. My amount of eggs would be 2 eggs. I can put in my amount of flour that I will need, 3 cups. Maybe I need 1.5 cups of sugar. So I want to put in my amounts of these things, a 1/2 teaspoon of salt. So I want to fill in some details about these different things. I want to get all the details down. Once I get my details down and I've typed those in, you'll have a list like this, a bulleted list listing all of the materials that you've thought of. Now, it doesn't mean that this is the final list. You should always refine. So after writing the instructions, you want to refine your list and try to make sure that you have everything that you need for your experiment, and also that everything is labeled specifically and with details. So after you've done that first draft of your materials list, you'll go on to type your instructions. Your instructions on how to carry out your procedure. So you'll just start typing out, okay, what am I going to do to carry out this experiment? But before you do that, okay, before you just jump into the instructions, go back to your question and look at your question. It says, how does the amount of baking powder affect the height of cupcakes? So in my example, I'm going to need to think, right? And you will think about your question in terms of what you need to measure and what needs to be changed in your procedure, what amount or what variable needs to be changed. And so when I look here, I see, first of all, here's my variable, the amount of baking powder. So I'm going to do a little bit of labeling. This will have to change in my procedure. So before going to the instructions, do a little bit of thinking in terms of your question and what you are measuring. The other thing you need to think about besides your variable is what you are measuring. What data are you going to collect based on your question? So here, I'm going to have to measure my height somehow, the height of the cupcakes. So I think I'll definitely be using some kind of ruler. Okay, and I'll need to measure the height before and after, because I want to see how much the cupcakes rise from the beginning to the end. I will decide to measure that in centimeters. I need to decide what sort of units I'm going to measure my stuff in. The other thing you want to think about with what you're going to be measuring is how many times, how many trials should I have of my cupcakes? I shouldn't just measure one cupcake that has some amount of baking powder. So maybe I'm going to measure the height of 5 cupcakes each time, each amount of baking powder. So I want to make sure that I build in these trials into my experiment, and then think about, oh, okay, I'm going to need a data table. Okay, how am I going to record my data? So I'm going to have to record my data in a table and have the heights in a table. Just like in the data nugget where they had the masses of the crystals. So those are things you need to think about. How am I going to measure my height? Okay, or in your case, how are you going to measure the thing that you're supposed to measure? Where are you going to record the data? And how will you build in trials for each change that you make? What units are you going to measure the data in? So those are all questions that you should answer before you start writing your instructions. So the last thing, before you go on to write your instructions, think about how you will keep things the same. Okay, how will you keep consistency while only changing your variable? Okay, you want to make sure that the change that you see or any results that you see come from your variable and not from anything else. So make sure that you work into your procedure ways to keep everything the same except for your variable. So now you can go down to your instructions and start listing what you're going to do. So I think I should first preheat the oven to 375 degrees Fahrenheit. And then you'll go on to mix and so on. Okay, so you'll write a list of instructions, doing a first draft, and keep going and write down what you are planning to do to carry out this experiment. So once you do that, you'll have a draft of your instructions, something that looks like this. Okay, and so consider this a draft. Once you finish this, go back to your materials list and look at your instructions and say, is there anything that I'm missing in my materials list? Maybe I need a rack to cool my cupcakes on. Go look at your instructions and see if there's anything that you want to change that makes your instructions more reasonable. For example, maybe I don't want to mix together 3 cups of flour and do this whole recipe. Maybe I just want to do a third of the recipe and change these amounts and not use a huge amount that's going to make 12 cupcakes. The other thing that you have to think about is, how am I going to record my data? So here, when it says measure the height, maybe I need to add in a step that says record the height in a data table. So you need to make sure that you put in those steps that allow you to record the data appropriately into a table or some kind of list. So I hope this video was helpful in helping you think about your procedure and The next video is going to be on how to write a good data analysis when you're not actually doing the experiment.